today to talk about an incredibly relevant topic as it's midterm election times in the United States. I'm Gwen Young, and I'm the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative and the Women Public Service Project at the Wilson Center. And I'm honored to moderate today's session and presentation of the research done by Saskia Brenchenmacher. Am I right? Did I get your name right? I forgot to ask you before I got up here. But I'm delighted to welcome you all here today on the topic of closing the gender gap in U.S. politics, lessons from Europe. The way today is going to flow is Saskia is going to present research on a paper that she's done. Then we are going to sit down and I will moderate a discussion between Saskia, Cynthia, and Michelle. We'll introduce them in a moment. And we will have some Q&A from the audience. And so I encourage you to be thinking about some of the really interesting topics that are raised in the paper and other pressing topics that you have on your mind. Saskia Brenchenmacher, which will now be your name, is an associate fellow in Carnegie's Democracy and Rule of Law program, and her research focuses on gender, conflict, and governance, as well as trends in civil activism and civil society repression. Prior to joining Carnegie, Saskia worked as a researcher at the World Peace Foundation and the Institute for Human Security in Boston. Brenchenmacher is a graduate of Carnegie's James C. Gaither Jr. Fellows Program and gained experience at the Carnegie Europe in Brussels, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in London, and Europeum Institute for the European Policy in Prague. So she's got both the U.S., but mainly a European perspective, which is lovely. And on our panel today, we have Cynthia Ritchie-Terrell, founder of Represent Women and Fair Vote. And she's served as board member on charitable organizations and Quaker institutions, including the Americans Friends Service Committee and the Sandy Spring Friends School. Cynthia has worked in the area of systems reform in this country and abroad, traveling in 1993 to New Zealand to support that country's successful referendum to adopt a proportional voting system. And no doubt is responsible for the fact that the Prime Minister of New Zealand today is a woman.
Mm-hmm. Completely.
Call that, you heard it first
that,
here
yes.
today. That is your.
I was tweeting about it in 1993. You can check.
And our other panelist today is Michelle Whitaker, and she's a communications strategist with over 15 years of experience in foreign and nonprofit communications. And your expertise is in strategic messaging, constituent engagement, and media outreach. So we're welcome and honored to have you here, Michelle. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Saskia, and I want to hear about the latest research. So thank you.
Thank you, Gwen, for that kind introduction, and thank you for coming and joining us here today for what will hopefully be an interesting discussion. I'll try to keep the presentation relatively short because I want to make sure we have time to delve into some of the policy implications and also discussion of the current political moment, both among our wonderful panelists, but also with all of you. So I look forward to your questions. Before I start, I wanted to give a bit of background on the paper itself and where this project came from. Our program here at Carnegie, we're a foreign policy think tank, and our program, the Democracy Program, has traditionally looked at democratic change abroad and efforts by international actors to support democratic change abroad. So this is a little bit new territory for us. But for the past several years, we've been thinking that the distinction between democratic challenges abroad and at home doesn't really make that much sense anymore, given that we're seeing a convergence. In many parts of the world, democracies are suffering from similar challenges, and it increasingly makes sense to look at them in a more comparative perspective. And that's what we've been trying to do, and that's also what we think is our comparative advantage as a foreign policy think tank, is to try and introduce a bit more of a comparative perspective to current challenges and democratic problems experienced in the United States. So this paper on women's representation in the US is really part of a broader series of analysis that we've been working on, trying to introduce both European perspectives, but also broader comparative perspectives on issues like political party reform, election meddling, and other issues. Now, to go back to the paper that we're discussing here today, many of you will know that when it comes to women's representation in politics, this is really one area where the US has fallen behind in international rankings. In 1997, the US ranked 41st in the world when it comes to representation of women in parliaments. Now it's 101st, so that's quite a significant drop from an already not so great starting point. I won't spend too much time talking about the statistics, as many of you will be familiar with them. It's enough to say that there are currently only around 20% of women in Congress, Senate, and House combined, around 25% in state legislatures, and the picture is not much better at the local level or when we look at governors either. And what's particularly striking is that the pace of change has been very slow over the past several years. When I looked at the numbers for state legislatures, what was striking that the 20% threshold was already crossed in 1993, but now we're still in 2018 at 25%. It just hasn't been that much progress. Now, many of you will have been following the headlines over the past several months that there are many more women running for office now in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential election, and that's certainly an exciting development. But what I say in my paper is that there are reasons to remain cautious, and that even though it's an encouraging trend, it may not be enough to really end the fundamental gender imbalance that we face in US politics, and there's several reasons for this. First, it's not only women who've been politically energized. There are a lot of more men running for office too, and that's something that maybe hasn't been reported on as much, as it's not as much of a new trend. But that means that overall, women still don't make up the majority of new candidates. And then secondly, a lot of women running in difficult districts against incumbents, and we know that in the US, incumbents have a very high electoral advantage, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So it's not impossible to defeat them, but it is certainly going to be difficult. And then lastly, any gains in women's representation are likely to accrue primarily to Democrats. And while that's not necessarily a problem, it won't help address the much more, or the bigger gender imbalance on the Republican side. Now, when we look to Europe, the picture looks quite different. And I don't mean to overstate positive change. There's still a long way to go, even in European democracies. I myself am from Germany, and Germany's made a lot of progress over the past several years, but then in the last election, we've seen the number of women in parliament go down again. So the battle is not over, and gender parity definitely has not been reached. But we do see that a number of Western and Northern European democracies have been much more successful than the United States. The Nordic countries often get pointed to as the main examples, like Iceland and Norway and Sweden, but also countries like Belgium, like Denmark, Spain, the UK, France, have all made significant progress and have come close to crossing that 40% barrier or threshold, similarly in the European Parliament as well. Now, what's striking when you look at debates around women's representation in Europe, that the debate is often quite a different one from the one people are having or women's organizations are having in the United States. Here, it strikes me that the debate has very much focused on the lack of women running, that there's still this big gap between men and women, that there are much fewer women than men who make the jump and actually decide to run, and that is causing the imbalance that we're seeing in politics. When you look at Europe, that really hasn't been the focus of the debate. In fact, it's been quite difficult for me to find data on sort of the gap in political ambition, as it's often called, between women and men across different European democracies, as most of the advocacy has focused much more on institutional reforms. How can we change political parties and parliaments and the institutional incentives to make sure more women get elected independently from any gap in political ambition between women and men? And there's institutional reasons for that, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But I think that was quite a striking difference compared to the debate that is happening here, which has also given rise to a large number of civil society organizations that are trying to get more women to run, that are training candidates, trying to raise funding for them, etc. And the argument that I make in the paper is that those efforts are absolutely essential and crucial, but they may not be enough, that other changes may be needed, given the obstacles that women currently face that are not just individual nature, but also more institutional and structural. And specifically, I identify 4 areas where US reformers could potentially learn from reforms and institutional changes that have happened in Europe. And this isn't to say that you can simply transplant those reforms from Europe to the United States. Obviously, there are differences in political culture and institutions that would make that very difficult. But there are nevertheless, I think, outside perspectives that can be useful to try and identify potential reform initiatives that might actually work in the US and for which there's already a precedent, particularly at the local level. And we'll talk more about that in our discussion. So the 4 areas I highlight in the paper are, first of all, the electoral system. Second, party recruitment and the role of political parties. Third, campaign finance. And fourth, reforms to make political institutions themselves more gender sensitive. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. But first, it's worth taking a step back and just briefly recapping what are some of the barriers that women face in US politics. And I already mentioned that there's this individual level gap, that there are just fewer women running for office. And there's a whole bunch of research on why that is the case and the socialization role and gender roles and how that all impacts why women are potentially less likely to see themselves as qualified. I won't go into that, but we can, if you're interested, we can always talk about that in the discussion. But I think what's important to highlight is that that's not the only factor. There are also certain institutional reasons why it's been more difficult in the United States. And first of all, as I mentioned, the electoral system plays a huge role. Comparative research shows repeatedly that women do much better in proportional representation systems and in multi-member districts than in first past the post voting systems like the one that exists in the United States. Second, incumbents, as I mentioned, have a much higher electoral advantage in the US than in other majoritarian systems, and definitely much more than in PR systems. As a result, there are very few open seats in each election, and it's difficult for women to enter the political system given that most incumbents are male. And then thirdly, American elections obviously are self-financed. They depend heavily on candidates stepping forward themselves and raising money themselves, specifically to make it through the primary stage. And that's also quite unusual. It's very different from how the European systems work. And while women tend to raise similar amounts of money as men, they do face some gender-specific fundraising hurdles, and I'll also come back to that in a little bit. So coming back to those four areas, first of all, electoral reform. Most European democracies use proportional representation rules in multi-member districts. And a number of European countries actually use mixed electoral systems. So they combine some elements of proportional representation with majoritarian elements as well. Germany is one of those countries. And what's interesting is that time and time again, you see more women entering the German parliament through the party lists and the PR system than through the first past the post voting. So this is the difference we see across countries and even within countries where you can hold other factors constant. What is this? Why is this the case? So what is it about PR systems? We can get into a complicated discussion of electoral system design, and I think we'll leave some of that for the discussion as well, as we have people here on the panel who are much more expert than I am. But we can briefly say that what the research shows is that in multi-member districts and proportional representation systems, parties have just very different incentives than they have, for example, in the US. Because often you will, first of all, put forward a list of candidates, you have an incentive to try and balance the candidates on that list. You won't put forward a list of all men because you're trying to appeal to a broad electorate. And then the second issue is also that voters themselves can balance their tickets. They're voting for multiple candidates. They don't have to choose between them. So again, they can vote for female as well as male candidates. So it's just a fundamentally different system compared to a US system where the party, it's much more decentralized. The party, insofar as it plays a role, it really is trying to get the best candidate for a particular district who's most likely to win, rather than thinking about, oh, how many candidates, how many women versus men are we running across the state or the country? That just doesn't factor into the equation very much. So what does that mean for the US? It's very unlikely that the US will completely abandon its current electoral system, switch to proportional representation. But what some US reformers have advocated for is potentially introducing more ranked choice voting in the United States. Some of you may already be familiar with that, but basically it is a system to try and introduce more proportionality into the US electoral system as it currently exists, without having to switch to a party-less system like it exists in some European democracies. So you would maintain elements of the current US electoral system, particularly the focus on individual candidates and the ties candidates or representatives have to their constituencies, while still allowing, first of all, voters to choose multiple candidates per district potentially, but also changing the incentives of parties. Because in a ranked choice voting system, as the name suggests, voters can rank all the candidates in orders of preference, and those get aggregated in various ways, so that parties, in fact, have an incentive to run candidates that have broad majority support and appeal to as much of the electorate as possible, because you're not just trying to get the first votes, but also the second and third votes of other constituencies. So it would fundamentally shift the way we think about winning elections. And there are already examples of the system functioning in the US at the municipal level. There's various cities across the US that have adopted it. And there's some evidence to suggest that it benefits women candidates, also minority candidates, and has other positive effects, for example, increasing civility in political discourse, also reducing costs of elections because you avoid runoffs. So we can discuss more how the mechanics of it work, but I just wanted to lay it out as one way the US electoral system could be changed in a way that kind of mirrors some of the incentives that currently exist in a lot of European democracies. The second main area concerns the role of parties. So electoral system design is not the solution to all problems, and we see this because obviously electoral systems often haven't changed over many years, and yet we see rapid increases in representation of women over time. And a lot of the time, the reason for that is the adoption of gender targets or quotas by political parties. And most of you will be familiar with the idea of gender targets or quotas. They tend to be quite controversial, but often also discussions around them are not necessarily based on evidence or a lot of in-depth knowledge of what they actually look like in practice. So in the paper, I go into some case studies, especially the UK and Sweden, to explain how quotas were adopted by different parties in those countries and how they've played out over time and the effects they've had. But here I'll just summarize a few key points that I think are important to know or to remember. The first is that in Europe, the most common form of quotas are really party-level quotas. So they're not national quotas that are forced on all parties. It is parties themselves choosing to adopt a quota due to internal or external pressure. Second, in a lot of cases, they started out as voluntary targets, often in the 70s and 80s as the women's movement was gaining strength, and women members of political parties were really frustrated that they made up the rank and file of political parties, but they weren't seeing any gains in representation. So they started pushing parties to adopt at least some soft quotas, some soft commitments of running more female candidates in future elections. But then often what you see is that there's a strengthening of these quotas over time as women continue to mobilize, and also as there's a diffusion effect across parties. What happened in a number of European countries is that you had left-wing parties, green parties, that emerged in the 70s and 80s that adopted more radical quota measures because they were trying to make a point. We're the party for gender equality. We're the ones that are defending women voters, trying to get women into politics. And then suddenly that put a lot of pressure on centrist parties, for example, because suddenly the Social Democrats couldn't really claim that they were the ones who were really helping women get into politics, that they were the ones defending women's interests. And so you saw a diffusion effect where then suddenly the Social Democratic Party saw an electoral strategic interest in also adopting some quota measures. And you see this even on the conservative side, and I think that's quite interesting. A lot of right-wing parties in Europe have been very reluctant to adopt gender quotas because similarly as here, it doesn't really fit the sort of key ideological premises of a lot of conservative parties. But what has nevertheless happened is that as other parties have adopted these measures and the representation of women in these parties has radically increased, they've increasingly been forced to take other measures, at least to prove that they don't even need quotas. So trying to put more effort on examining their own recruitment practices, creating other structures that try and get more women into leadership positions, because otherwise, again, there's this fear of losing female members and losing women voters. And you see that dynamic playing out in countries like Sweden, the UK, Germany, and others. Then I think the last thing to mention about quotas is that, yes, not all quotas are effective. There's a lot of variation in design, whether they fit with the existing political institutions, how much leadership commitment is there really. So it's not the case that you can just implement some sort of soft target and suddenly it will lead to rapid increases in women's representation. But I nevertheless suggest in the paper that setting some sort of recruitment target on the side of political parties may nevertheless be an important first step, as such targets currently don't really exist. And when we look at both main US political parties, we see that party initiatives to recruit more women have been fairly fractured and relatively poorly institutionalized and poorly resourced. So there have been various efforts in the Democratic Party since the late 1990s and Republican Party a bit more recent. But for the most part, they're not very well known. People don't know about them. It's not clear, there's not a lot of evidence that a lot of candidates have been recruited through these initiatives. And they've not been very well resourced either. So perhaps setting a target, potentially at multiple levels, would be a first step toward then also developing some sort of more strategic plan about how these targets are supposed to be met, which would probably mean investing more resources into a more institutionalized initiative to try and develop a strong pipeline of female candidates. The third area I discuss in the paper is the area of campaign finance. This is obviously a hugely contentious issue that's been on the table for a long time in the United States. When we look at Europe, the picture looks just fundamentally different, given that most elections are much more heavily publicly subsidized, and that election costs in general are much lower due to various factors, including caps on spending. As a result, candidates don't have as big of a fundraising burden. It's not the case that there are no financial hurdles at all. There is quite a bit of evidence that even in Europe, women candidates have a harder time raising money, and finances can play a role, particularly for women from less socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds. So it does play a role, but it's just not comparable to the role finance plays in US elections. In addition, a number of European governments have also institutionalized certain types of initiatives to either penalize or incentivize parties to recruit more female candidates. Ireland, for example, I think has now a rule that if you don't have 30% of your candidates, if 30% of your candidates aren't, or if you don't meet the 30% threshold for female candidates, your public subsidies will be cut by up to 50%, so it's quite significant. Again, what does this mean for the US? I think there are various potential implications. I'll just go through them briefly. One could envision more party-level initiatives to incentivize local-level recruitment and also to support women, particularly at the primary stage. One could imagine fundraising or funding targets for PACs, which play a hugely important role in the current campaign finance world, and which the research shows currently underfund women candidates in open seat races. So this is a troubling trend, given that those are the races that women are most likely to win. And then lastly, a shift to local public financing schemes may also be one avenue to incentivize, first of all, more women to run, because surveys show that women feel like they would be more likely to run if elections were publicly financed. But also we see from existing states and cities that have some sort of public financing scheme that there tends to be an uptick in the number of female candidates and also candidates from other underrepresented groups. So that might be another avenue forward, even though it is somewhat limited given the limits on campaign finance reform right now at the federal level. And then the last issue I'll address is this question of how do we make our political institutions themselves more gender sensitive? And I think this is something that gets talked about a bit less than some of the other reforms I mentioned, even though it is hugely important. And over the past several months, we've seen all these discussions of sexual harassment, for example, in legislatures, in Congress, but also in state legislatures in the US. Same issue in Europe, where there's been a whole range of scandals affecting both staffers, but also female legislators themselves. But I think this is only a small part of a much broader range of issues. Because if we think back, I mean, parliaments were not set up for or by women. So they tend to be, in their structure, in their setup, fairly patriarchal institutions. And the fact that you now have more women entering these institutions hasn't necessarily changed the way they function. And we see this in very basic things, like how easy is it actually for parliamentarians to also have caregiving roles to combine their political careers with family life. We think of legislators in Congress as very privileged individuals, but there's so many office holders across the US in state legislatures at the local level for whom it is quite difficult to combine caregiving roles with political careers unless there are changes in the ways these institutions are set up. But there are other issues, for example, how many women actually make it into leadership roles, and what are the processes for selecting leaders of important committees, for making sure women actually have the power within these legislatures to make a real difference. And then, as I mentioned, there's issues of work culture, sexual harassment, sexism, etc. So none of these issues have been solved in European parliaments. They're extremely prevalent and still big issues, but there are nevertheless a number of initiatives that I think are interesting and could potentially also be applicable to a US political context. First, there's a number of parliaments in Europe that have taken steps to, for example, change their working hours, ensure that there's no voting at midnight on Fridays, for example, on important legislation, but instead have more limited working hours, and making sure plenary sessions end at a certain time, have parental leave and childcare options for parliamentarians who also have families or are raising children. Some have initiated kind of more comprehensive efforts to just measure and quantify somehow the experiences of female legislators. So both the Swedish and the Finnish parliament have instituted comprehensive studies where they actually surveyed female and male legislators to understand how gender structures their experiences in these political institutions. And that is just the kind of data collection effort that we haven't really seen in the US, neither at the federal nor at the state level, to get a better sense of what are the actual barriers and what could be done, which really is a first step to then developing more comprehensive plans or setting up working groups or committees that are really focused on these internal gender equality issues. And related to that, a number of European parliaments have set up specific structures that regularly monitor progress, that set commitments, that hold the institution accountable to its progress. So I think I'll end here on this note, and I think we can delve further into any of these issues in our discussion.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Saskia. And I love the way we laid it out into these four categories. And you probably saw a lot of us here nodding because we work in those categories. And to stay in the theme that you talked about is really this is about institutions and systems, right? This is, what I think we really want to talk about today is let's all assume that the women are there, that they want to be there, right? Let's look at these system signs that are sort of keeping this gap alive. So I want to start a little bit with the role of the parties, specifically. And Michelle, maybe I'll turn it to you and Cynthia to follow too, just to sort of feedback on some of what Saskia said. What role and how much influence do these parties in the United States play on women's decision to run for office and their chances of success? Let's sort of dive deep a little bit into the role of the party. You mentioned quotas, and I think one of the things for people that don't know a lot about quotas is to realize a lot of the quotas in Europe were party quotas. They weren't sort of part of the Constitution or part of a national piece of legislation. So Michelle, in your experience, how important is the party?
Yeah, so first, thank you everyone for this is a wonderful opportunity to discuss really how we look and improve our election systems and really envision a 21st century democracy that has women included and as equal members of making decisions and helping to set the policies that impact all of us. I think when we're looking at parties and how their role, there's both the recruitment piece. So how are they looking at the bench? And I know in some cases it's more, less of them being involved because of the primary system, more of like, whoever steps up. But there are roles to be played either within the defined party structure or just in making sure that there are opportunities to train folks to understand, like, how do you file for office? How do you get involved? When is the primary happening? So that they actually know, like, this is an option for them. I think it's really interesting to think about how the targets within parties can help to create that additional incentive for other parties to take that action. I think we've seen that both with the Democratic and Republican parties as they've seen them institute some parity measures and in their leadership structure, not in recruitment structure, and that's kind of fed into them doing that, at least when you look at some of the leadership coming out. But if we're talking about candidates actually being recruited to run, I think they take a step back, in that process. But I think that there's an opportunity to say, how are we creating a system that actually gives them an opportunity to participate, gives women an opportunity to know and how to run, what the opportunities are to run, and what systems are available, and have even access to data about what races are really competitive and opportunities for women to succeed well. And it's not just, it's about recognizing if we are falling short in one area, we need to take action to help to lift up all folks and have that equal representation. So
yeah. Cynthia, what are some of the best practices you've seen, and we'll come back to some of Saskia's research in terms of these parties, of what they can do to really bring women in, ensure their chances of success, right? And
Yeah, I think that the research on this has been pretty spotty in the United States, frankly, and that's something that a number of us in Coalition are trying to figure out how to document better. What are best practices, and what are some of the things that are replicable models that people can share across levels, state party to federal party, et cetera. There's certainly a rich history, picking up on a thread from what Michelle said, in the United States of parties. In fact, the Republican Party led the way in the teens, talking about the idea of gender quotas for the internal party members, and I'm not sure when the conversation about convention delegates happened. I think that was later on. The Democrats actually, I think, picked that up in the 20s, and then both parties have expanded the use of gender quotas for their local level political leadership, for their state parties, for their national committees, and for their convention delegates. So it is an interesting kind of paradox that they get the internal decision-making. Somehow there's been leadership in that area that was pretty impressive, I think, to say we acknowledge that gender representation is important, and we're going to figure out rules to institute it. We work with Hogan Lovells, who's a great pro bono legal team, and they created for us this 100-page document of every quota rule that every party has adopted in the history of the country. It's a mammoth thing. My colleague Tony and I are just trying to figure out how do we make this accessible to people, practitioners who want to download it and know what can work. Anyway, so there is this rich legacy in the United States of parties doing that. There's certainly an opportunity for party leaders to take on more of a role in this. And I'm reminded of the Rooney Rule in national football, where if you're hiring a coach, there's got to be a diverse panel of people you're considering. And I think there's a role, and now Chuck Schumer has taken that up in the US Senate to say, look, when we're looking at hiring staffs, we're going to be intentional around race. And I believe we need to do the same thing on gender. And everybody has heard me wonder, what can we call that rule? And I've toyed, is it the Patsy Mink rule or the Kathleen Matthews rule? I'm trying to convince her.
Yeah, catch you till you
yeah. But that same sense of urgency and agency from party leaders to say, we are going to look at this whole spectrum of choices we make through a gender lens, and being intentional about that. And I'll give a quick example of an opportunity for a specific reform. Some countries have what's called a replacement mandate, where if somebody is sitting in office, they commit to making sure somebody is recruited to fill their spot. We just saw with Tad Cochran in Mississippi, appointed a woman that if I happen to have written an op-ed telling him to do so the week earlier. I'm not sure he read that once again, but fingers crossed, maybe he was responding somehow. But that's the kind of demonstration that gender matters that elected officials can take to say, look, right now, for example, I also have been pushing Senator Leahy and Senator Sanders to make a commitment that's public, to say we're going to make sure a woman is recruited to run, not that she wins, but that she's recruited to run when we step down from the U.S. Senate. So I think there's leadership at that level as well.
So we talked a little bit about sort of this political will piece of it, and Saskia, I want to drill down a little bit on sort of the consequences, in Europe specifically, if you don't present this list of candidates. I was with an Albanian parliamentarian this week who was saying the parties would just rather pay the fine for the lack of the female candidate than to actually put them there. So I want to get your thoughts a little bit more on some of that.
Yeah, that's definitely been the case in a number of countries. France, that's been an issue as well, where there are fines if you don't meet a certain threshold, and repeatedly parties have preferred to pay the fine, which is partly an indication that maybe the sanction isn't high enough, and that it's not working very well. But it also shows the lack of leadership commitment on the side of the party, right? And that's one of the themes we see time and time again. It's not necessarily getting the target or the recruitment target or the quota as kind of the first step. And in all European countries, that's been the result of a lot of mobilization on the side of women, or them working with partners in party leadership or in the government. But it's usually been the first step, and then you have to continue advocating for better implementation, for making sure it fits institutional context when you see things like that happening, and also making sure there's continued leadership commitment. So I think that's one of the key lessons we see across Europe, is that it's not the case that you can just have these targets and then the work is done, but you see continued mobilization around them. But they're a useful tool for restarting the conversation around each election. Why are these targets not being met?
And I think, Cynthia and I talk a lot when we talk about it, sort of in the U.S. context, we try to say it's just part of, one tool that needs these whole other things with it, right?
Yes.
Is that how we talk about it? I
we
think
do,
that
yes.
is how we talk about it, which is great.
Yes.
I want to go to the next mechanism, because I think this is interesting in terms of the ranked choice voting and the proportional representation. And I'm going to start with you, Cynthia, this time, because you brought up the ranked choice voting, and give the audience a sense of what that means. Where is that happening? What states are adopting that? what does success look like for them?
Yeah, it's a fascinating, as probably this audience knows, we have a system of voting that's based on winner take all. And that's a relatively antiquated system at this point, given the rest of the world. Most countries use some kind of a proportional representation system, and that is varied, as Saskia pointed out. That can be a mixture of a geographic-based system and a party-based system. Some countries have a straight preferential vote, like the Australian Senate and Ireland and Malta, and et cetera. Not to go into too much detail right now. Happy to answer questions. But the thing that Fair Vote and my husband, who is director of that, and I've been working on for a number of years now, is this idea that we don't have to settle for that in the United States. We don't have to settle for that winner-take-all, binary choice, zero-sum game voting system that really incentivizes incivility, that costs a lot of money because of that negative campaigning, that leads to plurality winners, meaning somebody who gets elected with only 38% of the vote or 45% of the vote, who's clearly not the candidate of the choice of the majority of voters. And that reality has led to a number of jurisdictions adopting ranked choice voting. Maine, notably, is the first state to use it. They're going to be using it in the June primary. And that was because of this history, in part, of the governor. The last, I think, 9 of the last 10 gubernatorial candidates or winners were won with a plurality of the vote, meaning that the majority of people in Maine did not vote for the candidate who took that office, which I think we don't have to explain why that's a problem in democracy. So now there are 12 cities or so that use it. Some use it for mayor, some use it for their city councils. And what we're seeing is, as Saskia pointed out, an increase in civility. In fact, there was the Santa Fe, New Mexico used it just this month. And there was a funny op-ed saying, like, the most unheralded civility we've ever seen in this country has happened in this race. It was almost alarming that people were trying to seek consensus. And if we were all running, I'd be trying to find out ways in which, because I want Michelle's voters to rank me second if I'm running against Michelle, or Gwen's voters to rank me third. So there's a built-in incentive, and it's all about incentives, to behave in a more civil way. Running civil grassroots campaigns tends to attract women to the process, because that's something that many of us excel at in any case. And for outsiders to the political process, that's a way in that doesn't require this old boys network. And then the fact that sometimes, as you said, primaries and generals are combined means that it costs less to run. So perhaps a lower income woman who wants to run in Oakland, California, which uses ranked choice voting, is more likely to run in the first place, because she sees that hurdle is just one election instead of 2 elections spanned out over 9 months. And then the flip side of that is that it fixes the problem with runoffs in a number of states that have these low turnout runoffs after the fact, where there's an election and then some much smaller subset of the population comes back in December or even in January to decide the winner. So ranked choice voting addresses the spoiler effect in our elections. It addresses the incivility, which we I think can all attest to the fact there's incivility now. It opens the door for different kinds of candidates because of those things and because of the lower cost. And the track record so far is that, and of course there are lots of other causal relationships for this, but women make up about 50% of the elected officials on city councils with ranked choice voting, and the national average is about 25%. Exactly. So that's a pretty different story.
Saskia, you did talk about the proportional representation. You talked about it benefiting women. I want to go down a little bit, sort of building on Cynthia's comments, and sort of all candidates. Like how does proportional representation, and you're looking at Europe, assuming that it's similar to the ranked choice, there's differences, right? But
yeah, and there's differences in there's different types of proportional representation systems, especially in differences in how party lists get constructed, with sometimes voters being the ones who actually determine the ranking, and sometimes it's set by the parties. And there's some evidence showing that the closed lists, as they're called, where really this is a party internal process, tend to be the ones that most benefit women. We can talk about why that is, but generally, I think the consensus is that closed party lists and proportional representation system with large districts tend to benefit women most. I think South Africa is often used as an example where that's been incredibly effective. Because, if you're a party putting forward a list of candidates, I mean, maybe 40 years ago it was acceptable to have 10 women on that list, but nowadays it's no longer acceptable. You'll face a lot of pressure, particularly in a multi-party system when you're competing against parties that may be doing a much better job. So even if you're ideologically opposed to quotas, you still have some incentives to try and balance, not just to get women on that list, but also just in general kind of try to reflect the population. There are obviously issues with these lists. What happens in a lot of countries is that women get to the bottom of the list and they're not ranked in the top positions. That creates problems. And that's also why large districts tend to benefit women most, because then you go deeper into the list. But that's also something that these quota measures have tried to address by trying, for example, Sweden now has a zipper system for the Social Democratic Party where they alternate female and male candidates on the list. So you don't end up having this problem where all the women are somehow magically at the bottom of the list.
On the backside.
Magic. Or, or at least making a commitment that a certain number of the top 10 candidates will be women. There's various ways of doing it, but to ensure that actually that translates into actual representation in parliament in the end.
I think it's interesting, and I think because you brought it up in terms of the quotas, both party quotas in the United States, starting with the Republican Party and sort of pulling in the conservatives in Europe, which are arguably not the same parties, right? But I'm going to start with Cynthia, and then Michelle, we're going to pull you into the trend this year, these women that are running for office, and it's not just the trend, but I think it's the trend on sort of the who's in office, tends to be this democratic surge, right? And I think when you look back over history in the U.S., it's a fair amount of democratic women. What explains that imbalance?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I feel like I wish we had a week to spend just talking about that. There was certainly a time, we just did a chart, in fact, that looks at the whole span of 1917, 1916 to 2018. And women's representation, the first woman elected, of course, was a Republican from a multi-seat district, I might add, in Montana, which was heavily Democratic. The Democrats were like, oh my God, we can't have a Republican woman getting elected. So they gerrymandered her out while she was in office, switched back to single-member districts, and she wasn't able to win again, which is true. That's the challenge that Republican women face in many respects today. So for the long arc of history through the 1900s, women from both parties occupied about the same percentage of seats. There was a sudden change in about 1970 where Democrats, I think, in large part due to the burgeoning feminist movement and a greater sense of women's role and importance and representation and sense of equity around politics, the Democratic Party probably was more open and took more measures to advancing women's representation. And the Voting Rights Act helped a lot. A lot of the black majority districts in the South and elsewhere were women were encouraged to run for those and have been successful in those offices. And then we saw in that, that year way back then in the last century, the year of the woman, that happened, and somehow we still need to.
We might be back on the year of the woman. I think we are, right?
Year two of the woman.
Year 2 of the woman.
It was right after a census and a redistricting process, so more Democratic women were elected in large part as a response to the political climate of that era. And then, of course, we've seen this increase in the support structure emerge, and Emily's List and many, many state groups that mobilize women to run on the Democratic side. And there hasn't been, for some of the reasons that I think Saskia touched on, that in terms of the intellectual frame for the Republican Party, that it hasn't been part of that frame to say we're going to elevate women specifically because they're women. They may be elevated because they're good leaders, or like the chair of the Republican Party right now is a woman. So it's not as though they haven't made some strides in that arena, but there's nothing like the emphasis on it on the Republican side as there is on the Democratic side. And coupled with that is this problem of winner-take-all primaries in this country that not only, of course, entrench the status quo, incumbents win, and when there can be a lot of great candidates running, as there are now, but when the rate of incumbency is 98%, it's super hard to see any turnover. And maybe the rate of incumbency now will only be 85%, but that still means that the people who are in office this year are going to be in office next year, no matter what. So
the incumbent effect.
Right. And then our current zero-sum game, winner-take-all politics makes it hard for moderate women to win those Republican primaries. And so there's very little wiggle room for them to be successful, either at the federal level or the state legislative level, I think, sadly.
Yeah. And I think I agree with Cynthia on that. And I, particularly on like the current political moment that we're in and how that's motivated more Democrats to obviously run in kind of response to the current administration and other things that are going on. But if you take a step back, it's really not, there's part of it that, yes, is about like the current administration, but it's also a question of what kind of democracy do we actually want? And if you're looking at, you know, members of Congress who are meeting to discuss healthcare and it's all men talking about it, how, as a woman, do you know if the needs that you have are actually going to be addressed or they're going to be, you know, cut out of the process? I mean, you know, it's often said in organizing and when you're working in terms of helping to get a seat at the table that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So oftentimes if we're looking at this and we're saying, you know, the people who are making these decisions aren't maybe there for our interest or have our interests in mind, we have to question that. And that's ultimately what it is. It's like if we're seeing that happening on healthcare, we're seeing that happening on a living wage, people are demanding that they have representatives who are actually about working for their interests, not the interests of, you know, corporate or big money. And so you have to change that dynamic, and that's why you start looking at reforms like ranked choice voting or public financing, which I will talk a little bit, I think, soon. But like those things are about how do we address this sense that you have, what you're seeing in terms of who's making the decisions and whether or not those decisions are actually related or working for my best interest as well as the interests of my community. And that motivates people to be like, this reform has the potential to address one of those issues. But I also want to just stress that we can't look at reforms in a singular way, because if we look at that, we're not really addressing the systemic issues that are impacting our democracy. If you were injured in an accident and you broke your arm and your leg, you wouldn't be happy if the doctor just mended your arm and said you can leave. It's like, I can't walk anywhere, I can't go, right? But oftentimes and sometimes when we've looked at reforms, we've gone with one reform and people think like, okay, we'll just do that one reform, and they haven't looked at the larger vision. Like, we have to make sure that we're addressing the systemic issues within political structures. We need to create public financing systems. We need to have ranked choice voting so that everyone's vote counts and it matters on an equal level. Like instituting all of those, and we're seeing that kind of holistic view of reforms happening in Washington. They passed a suite of reforms on voting rights recently. We see that in New Jersey. They're also considering that, and that's all related to the fact that we can't look at this as a single reform issue in terms of addressing women's representation issues and at larger, like making sure that we have a voice on the issues that matter most in our communities. It's about creating that holistic vision of democracy.
I want to pick up on that thread real quick and start with you, Saskia, on the theme of, I mean, you said a couple really good things. I mean, first, this is holistic. It's sort of systems reform, as we were talking about. The second is the notion of your government actually looking like the people, right? Also the notion of the government delivering policies and systems that benefit, you know, the communities. Arguably not just the U.S., but across the globe in the past 18 months or 2 years, these elections, everyone's going, wait, we missed somebody. You know, we missed a group of people, or how did this happen? How did Brexit happen? You know, how did Italy happen? How did the United States happen? Saskia, what were you finding in terms of sort of this discussion about sort of changing the systems and relation to sort of feeling like we may have missed the middle, or whatever the phrases are that people are using?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think the first question is kind of like, why does this even matter? Like all of this, why do we worry about having women in government? And yeah, as you say, it's not just, I see it as very much interlinked. It's not just about getting more women in government. That's one aspect of a broader problem of representation that we're facing, and that affects people of color, that affects people that are not super rich and mega wealthy in the United States, for example, right? So there's all sorts of problems of underrepresentation, of which the underrepresentation of women is one aspect, and it has some specific drivers, but it is also linked to these other issues. So I think looking at it holistically, we may see some commonalities. We wouldn't think that, for example, the sort of surge in right-wing movements in Europe is linked to the representation of women. It might even be a backlash in some ways, right? But in a way, they speak to a broader problem of like who are the people in government, who do they represent, and do people feel a connection to them, and what are we missing when we don't have more of those linkages, and when people don't view themselves as represented. And I think there's a lot of interesting research out there what both sort of just the descriptive representation does in terms of people's political participation, which is quite interesting, that yes, it does matter to see yourself represented. You're more likely to be engaged in politics, to follow those debates if you feel like they're led by people who are like you, who have similar experiences to you. And then there's obviously more specific effects when we look at why does it matter to have women in government. You mentioned the healthcare debate. There are certain legislative priorities that we tend to see women advancing. Now, in maybe 100 years, that won't be the case anymore because those would be priorities for everyone. But at the moment, there's still certain issues like gender equality, like parental leave, like childcare, that women tend to advance and that tend to get left out of the discussion if you don't have the women in government. And on a broader level, it's also about kind of, do you even have people who think about the gendered impacts of legislation, even if it's foreign policy or national security? Increasingly, we see that we miss a whole lot of important information if we look at it in a gender-blind way, rather than thinking about, okay, not only how does this affect women as a group, but also how does it affect men as a group, and how does it affect gender relations? And I think that's when we also miss a lot of this resentment that's happening among some male communities in the US, for example. If we don't have a gendered lens and don't understand these developments, both among women and men and relations between women and men, we miss a whole lot of what is happening, I think.
And it goes to your fourth point about the institutions being gender sensitive, and you see that with the Swedish feminist foreign policy, or you see that with Canada and Trudeau in the trade. Not only just women, but the indigenous rights and sort of the equitable, inclusive economic growth argument. So let's come to the thing that we've all been sort of talking about and bringing up in each of us, is the financing mechanisms. What are some of the, what are the best practices? What are some of these sort of financing, there's a huge disparity in the United States and Europe generally, right? Which I think, Saskia, you brought out incredibly well. What are some of the best practices to solving the cost? And Michelle, maybe I'll start with you, or what would be a way to get around that?
I think one is publicly funded elections, which there are a number of jurisdictions across the country that are using them. Both Cynthia and I live in a jurisdiction that Montgomery County, where they have introduced public financing, and we have a record number of candidates who are running for office at the county level under that program. And a significant number of women who are taking that option to run in the program. And so, whether it's through a matching system which exists in Montgomery County, or a grant system like you have in Connecticut, where each candidate gets a certain amount of funds, or vouchers, which exists in Seattle, which is a great program, which voters actually have these dollars that they're giving to candidates in the form of vouchers. There's different ways that you can help increase, again, participation and have voters feel like they have a voice in setting the agenda in terms of who we want to represent our communities. And you see women who are able to run on platforms that are about really critical social issues that may not be at the forefront. So public financing is a key part of it. On the other side of financing pieces are related to how we get PACs or institutions involved in this process. And I know Cynthia has done a lot of work and some research on that, so I want to pass that on to her to talk about.
Thank you. I'll just say, Michelle's the campaign manager for an incredible candidate who happens to be her sister also. So I think I'm allowed to say that here. But anyway, so check that. So she knows a lot about the implementation of those
First-hand
rules.
experience.
Right.
Yeah.
And which I guess I'll say just is a great example. And I think Saskia's points about quotas really raise this challenge, is that we can talk about ideas, we can pass ideas, but then we have to implement them once they're, and we have to create a good communications package around them. We have to make sure that people are actually fulfilling their pledges and they're accountable to them. We have to measure where they're successful or not. So anyway, I think that's tremendously important. But yes, the PAC research that we did several years ago looked at all the membership PACs and the rate at which they give to female and male candidates, and the extent to which I think that one of the lead findings I think that you mentioned was that there's a discrepancy in the amount of money that goes to women running in open seat races, which are the very races they're most likely to win. And that's particularly true for Republican women, who are really targeted with the most negative PAC money of any group, demographic group in the country. So that's another reason that that Republican women have a hard time. But one thing that I have been working on, and next time I'm here, I hope we'll report more successfully, is establishing relationships with PACs who are willing to take on a commitment to a certain amount of money or a certain percentage of money that increases over time to make sure that women candidates are getting as much money as male candidates. So there's some national PACs that are considering that right now, and I think that it's one of those tipping point issues where I suspect if we can convince 5 to 10 of the leading PACs to do something, it's this contagion effect. Other PACs will feel pressured to do the same, and particularly say if the National Beer Wholesalers Association takes a pledge to be more gender equitable in their giving, I would hope that the Sierra Club and some of the other PACs, some of us hold dear, would come and do the same.
Join the Beer Association.
Exactly. Exactly. So I think there's a lot of power in, to Michelle's point, we have to be employing all of the strategies we can all the time, as long as they're pragmatic and that we can test them, but we see the results of public financing and we can see the results of ranked choice voting, and fingers crossed, we'll see the results of this PAC target as well.
Saskia, what do you have to add to that in terms of public financing, sort of more equitable distribution through a PAC or a party, I suppose, of the resources that women get? What more do you want to add to that in terms of innovative ways?
I think, the key points have been made. I think it's really important to separate. There are these bigger issues with campaign finance and money in politics, right, that are huge issues and that will continue to be huge issues. And there's a wide range of organizations that are working on them, and it's really crucial work. But then we can also think about, what are the most intermediate steps that we can take? And I think the PAC example is a good one where, it's not ideal, but this is one way in which these organizations that have a lot of influence can use their money more effectively. So, I don't think I have much more to add than
practical and tangible.
Let's
try it out, let's see the results, right?
Yeah.
I'll just add one quick thing. The party leadership PACs play a huge role in determining who's a viable candidate in the country. So if the party leadership PACs would agree to some of these targets, then I think that we would begin to see a change at the state level as well, and that's
also
where
goes back to that leadership and intent thing. This has to be a real
exactly. And who are the gatekeepers in our community? Who gets to say who's running in Montgomery County and who's a viable candidate and who's not?
Who's not?
But I would also say that you have an opportunity. We have an opportunity if we're members of some of these organizations that do endorse and support candidates to pressure them internally. Like there's internal pressure that we can put on to say there's a demand for this. We want to see this from our organization if we're members of that, and we have to look at that as well. Like if we can't leave it up to just saying like, let's hope that they do it. The leadership comes up with it.
Or that it's so huge we have no role in it.
Exactly.
Right.
We have a role to play, and we can apply a lot of pressure, whether it's within our organizations or democracy as a whole, to say like these reforms matter and we want to see them, and we want to make sure that we have elected leaders who are going to help make sure that they happen and that there's good implementation on those reforms too.
Yeah. Well, on that, we've got a lot there that I think I'd love to turn it over to the audience. And I think we have microphones, if I'm correct. We do. And why don't we start right back here? And if you could identify yourself and where you come from, that also helps us know who's in the audience.
And I am from Montgomery County, Maryland, and I am frustrated in Montgomery County, Maryland. I'm a member of the Women's Democratic Club, and while we have public financing, I wanted, I guess, a little clarification on what's considered an incumbent, because we often have lots of candidates that are male that have been in one position, and then they go to get elected for the other position, so they have a lot of name recognition. So then when a woman tries to come in and be elected, they already have the name recognition. Like you mentioned, one of the candidates, we have a woman running for county executive, and we've never had a female county executive, and we even haven't had a woman run in 30 years. And all of the PACs are endorsing male candidates. So I don't know how you overcome that. Do we flood the PACs with women? I mean, how do you, because even some of the women have, like the Sierra Club, for example, one of their women wrote a bio of how they needed more women in political positions and in leadership, and then the Sierra Club backs predominantly males. So I just am very frustrated. So any suggestions would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I think Montgomery County will be an interesting study as the public financing continues about, what additional reforms are needed and how PACs like or organizations like Sierra Club, they were involved in actually implementing public financing and promoting it in Montgomery County and across Maryland. And there's a big effort to increase public financing for other offices, General Assembly, and things like that. I think, again, it goes to like the pressure internally within an organization, but also how we hold not only our leaders accountable, but our organizations. So if we have organizations who are saying that these are values that they really lift up, but when you look at what they're doing or who they're endorsing, and you're saying that doesn't seem to match, there's an opportunity for all of us to raise our voice and raise our concern, because if you don't, like, they have to, I mean, there's an opportunity for them to respond and say, why is this? And to ask that question and to really say, if this isn't going to be reflected in the leaders that you're endorsing, how do we achieve gender parity in Montgomery County or Maryland or the country as a whole? And then they have to, I mean, it's part of them having a responsibility to answer that and say how they're going to live into that reality, or live into the value that they have about gender and women's representation. So I think it's a hard piece. I'll say my sister who's running, she wrote an op-ed too on women's representation and how many of the organizations were conducting their endorsement process, because we're seeing that in terms of the numbers of how many men have qualified for public financing in the system, which is they've qualified at a higher rate than women have qualified. We've seen like they're getting more endorsements. So there's all these things where we can't, again, look at one reform and say that that's going to be the solution. But we can't also allow within the process to say we're just going to wait and see what happens. We have an active voice to say, now, like, here's how we can start to challenge this and see what happens, and motivate other voters or other members of institutions to take some action and be responsible for how they have a real impact on the election. So.
Thank you very much. My name is Marinaz Temior, and I'm a board member of Represent Women. Thank you for this really wonderful gathering, and some of the research that has come out is extremely useful for us. I wanted to ask you if you have, you brought up something about even when there is a penalty associated with not including people on the list, parties are willing to pay the penalty. Why is that? Is it because the penalty is not high enough? What reasons do they give? Is it because the candidates are not there? Because that might be useful to know in terms of supporting or kind of dealing with the issues. That's one question. And then maybe another question that, Michelle, you brought up the issue with parties being able to represent or putting candidates up. Oftentimes, what we hear is that even when we put in candidates and the women are in the position of power, we don't have the evidence that the decisions or the policies that are being implemented have, at least in the US, we don't have the data that shows that there's going to be a big difference. Is this something that we're trying to find? We're trying to find the data that shows what happens when there's actually women are more represented in office, because that would be something that would be useful to make a case for a more diverse and fair representation.
Well, do you want me to try and answer that first? And then
Sure.
So I would say that we definitely need more research on this. And Cynthia, they've done research when I used to work at Fair Vote, and the research we did on the impacts of representation with ranked choice voting and looking at San Francisco and the Bay Area, where they've had ranked choice voting for over 10 years, we see that there's obviously been an increase in the number of women who are actually holding office. And then I think there needs to be more studies on like what kind of policies do you see if there's a shift in policies. Using the example of public financing, one thing that we saw when public financing was introduced in Connecticut, it was introduced at a time when they were facing some serious crisis around financing and scandal related to that. The introduction of that created a flood of new candidates who were running, who were more representative of different communities than they had before, Latinos as well as women who were able to run. And within I think the first or second year of implementing it, those new leaders who came through public financing introduced a bill to cut off a package where all the bottle receipts were going back to the beer distributors, and instead said the money collected from that is actually going to fund programs in the state. Similarly, they did work on healthcare reforms and other legislation around immigrants and making sure that immigrants were welcome in the community. So we need to do more research of that in different places to see like what kind of correlations can we see with this, and we're not saying it's a one-to-one or anything like that, but do we see any shifts in how people are engaging on the issues, and what policies are coming out of that? And I think, again, where you have communities where there's more civil discussion on ranked choice voting, where you're having more of a civil discussion, it's about the issues and the policies, and like how do we move forward in our community to create the vision that people really want. And that's kind of a new dynamic that we need to encourage with all of the reforms that we see. And we do need a lot more studies, because most of them are very we don't have enough data on like what's going on in certain jurisdictions yet. So
Yeah, just to amplify what Michelle is saying, it's to a certain extent, I say it's a leap of faith. I mean, the data just doesn't exist because there's nowhere in the United States that women are a majority of the legislature. So we just can't possibly tell. We won't know until we're at that spot. And so I think we need to find other compelling messaging around the need to have women in democracy, because that's what makes democracy strong, period. And that's the intent of, going back to John Adams, having Congress be a portrait of the people in miniature. We're not yet a portrait of the people in miniature. And so I think that in some contexts, the answer to your question is very important, and I suspect that the data does exist in a more robust way in European countries. And some of the African countries, for example, it's very clear that women who have larger majorities in legislatures, a profound impact on economic decisions and on security and peace and so forth. But at the same time, I'm apprehensive about needing to have that in the United States, because I feel like the simple message that representative democracy depends upon everybody being represented should be sufficient. And so and we don't have anything to measure yet, because there's nowhere women have at least 45% of any legislative body in the United States. So I guess that's sort of a garbled answer, but.
I think that representative democracy in and of itself, but I think also you can borrow some of these examples from sort of whether it's the 12 to 28 trillion that McKinsey said in terms of economic growth, if women are equally participating. Mm-hmm. There's some studies of 6% GDP growth in the governance space. I've heard other people say, it is a correlation, right? Not a causation, not a one-on-one, but have we ever asked that of men, which I think goes back to, but that goes back to Michelle's comment about the policies and what you're seeing your government do. And one of the things, and Saskia, I'm going to turn it over to you on the quotas, but one of the things that I've seen in some of my work in Europe is this trust in government, right? So the European governments in a broad swath have these more progressive policies, whether that's family leave policies or more progressive, but there's this notion of the trust in the government. And when you have a trust in government, there's a lot of other things you ride out better as an economy or in terms of sort of peace and stability when your government looks like you and you think it's doing a good job. And the minute it doesn't, you don't ride out some of these bumps along the way. And so you sort of pull in the thinking, I would argue, from other sectors. But that sort of dovetails nicely with why do people pay the fine versus put more women there.
I mean, I think you said it correctly. I think often the argument you hear is, oh, we just didn't have enough qualified female candidates. We couldn't find them. Women just didn't want to run.
Not enough had been trained.
Yeah,
I
so
hate
I think
that.
those arguments, the same ones sometimes you hear there as well. I think the reality is, though, that, I mean, in a country of 60 million people or so, that just, it is surprising that, and it seems to be more of a problem maybe of recruitment, of political culture within the party, of who gets promoted and who gets to advance within those party structures, than just that you just can't possibly find any women. I mean, yeah, part of the problem is probably the fines are maybe not high enough, but it also, I mean, fundamentally it speaks to a bigger problem, right? It speaks to a lack of commitment on the side of some of the male leaderships, and you see still a lot of ideological resistance among male party members, not just in countries like France, also in other countries. I see this in Germany as well, especially among conservative parties, but also more broadly, that there's this idea that this is not meritocratic, that you're sort of putting women ahead of more qualified men or somehow giving them a leg up, that it kind of cuts against normal meritocratic practices. Now, it's a huge assumption that our normal political system is based on meritocratic practices, right? Which it isn't. There's all sorts of kind of inequalities and privilege built into it. But I can see why it would look to people like, why are you giving these women more of a chance, and sort of seeing it as a zero-sum game rather than something where everyone can participate if they're good enough, and where you have to have some mechanisms to address these structural and historical inequalities. I think that's often not recognized. It is interesting, though, that there has been some research, I think both in the UK and in Sweden, looking at, okay, who are these women who get selected through quotas? And consistently they find they're just as qualified, if not more, than the non-quota counterparts. And I think one study in Sweden, which was quite amusing, even found that the quality of the male candidates increased significantly. If you think about quality in terms of qualifications and constituency outreach and things like that, because there was more competition for. So seeing it as kind of anti-meritocratic, I think that doesn't really correspond to the evidence that we actually see. But I think those are still some of the arguments you hear.
Yeah, and the windows want to go back here because you've had your hand up.
My name is Lynn Olson. I can assure you we have no gatekeepers in Montgomery County, or wouldn't have 38 candidates running for 4 seats on the county council. But that's what I want to ask you about. How would ranked choice voting or proportional representation affect that race and help the women candidates win?
I'm so glad you asked that question.
You do it right now.
Waiting for this.
Yeah. So in Montgomery County, for those who don't know, it's 9 council, county council, and there's 4 at-large seats, and there are a total of it's 33 Democrats and 5 Republicans who are running for that. So we have a Democratic primary that's coming up, and so within that pool of 33 right now, the way that we vote, you're voting for your up to 4 candidates. So again, it's an at-large, it's a plurality system that still has the same impact of either having split votes or these weird outcomes in terms of you're still trying to get to 50%, but especially with this size of a field, it's going to be. I think we're going to see some fracturing in terms of how people are voting and who they're supporting in the race. Ranked choice voting would definitely benefit this race. This is the ideal case for it. In Montgomery County, within Tacoma Park, we have ranked choice voting already. The county has people have asked for this several times, and they haven't implemented it. I'm hoping that with seeing the interest in this race, that there's going to be more of a discussion about how we can actually implement this in the future. If we had the option of ranking the candidates instead of just voting for the 4 or not voting for any at all, I think you would actually be able to see how both the women in the race, but other candidates who might be minority candidates who don't have the same name recognition, but do have a large support base in another part of the county, East County or Up County, would actually benefit from having their voice heard. Because that's the other issue, is like oftentimes when the outcome seems to reflect only a certain region of the county. So that would again really help. There's also the issue of, when you look at it historically, overall at-large districts or areas disadvantage minority candidates who are running for office. And we've seen that that's been challenged, and those districts have been changed in the past. And so I'm very curious, and I want to see how this plays out in our county, because I think this could be another case to say, like, look, we have a majority minority county, 54% minority county. Depending on how the outcome of the candidates who come through the primary, if it doesn't reflect that, we have to seriously ask questions about the system, because we can't say it was like, oh, there weren't any viable candidates, or we didn't hear from them. And like, there's some really great candidates running. Not only my sister, who you should check out, but they're really great candidates who are running, and this system is going to disadvantage them, the current system that we have. So,
Cynthia, do you have something to?
Yeah, and it is just a breathtaking example of how having ranked choice voting would do everything that Michelle just said. So I think one of the things we're really looking for is energy around change. And we've testified in Annapolis, we've testified in Montgomery County, and frankly, incumbents immediately begin to game it and wonder, and the primary opposition is, I'm not sure that I could win a majority. And it requires me to actually have the majority support. So, I mean, like, if that's not a good indication of where incumbents' heads are, their fear is that they don't have the support of the majority of voters. So then I would say, well, if that's your fear, then it either may be time to change the way you behave in office and how responsive you are.
Get that support.
And so you can get that support, or support this system, and let's test out whether you can get a majority. Well, that's a Yeah. Well, let's talk afterwards for sure. But there are different
Minneapolis is a good
software.
example.
Yeah, there were 38 candidates for mayor, and how many could you rank? 3 or
I think
7?
it's 3, up to 3, yeah.
It's been a hardware and software issue with the voting equipment up until now. Now we've advanced, and Dominion, which owns a large number of the voting machines in the country, is certified to do any number of rankings. So Santa Fe, you could rank all of them, I believe.
I don't
quote me
know,
on that.
yeah.
Anyway, that's a rule that would have to be figured out in Montgomery County, but it might be possible to limit it to 8 or whatever it is.
Rank a certain portion, which actually forces people
Exactly.
to get along, but also limits
Right.
the
Yeah.
Right.
scope
Right.
from 38 candidates.
Right.
to
Right.
Package of 8.
Yes. And I think there's some interesting questions there that I don't know necessarily what the best practice is on, but after that large field in Minneapolis, they raised the bar to qualify to be a candidate. And I think there's some downsides to that, but there may be some upsides to that as well.
Well, and that was partially the filing fee was $25
$1.
or $50.
Oh,
So
yeah,
it was
Oh, wow.
it was really inexpensive to run and file for the raise, and so they did raise the bar on that. I think that did have an impact on the next race, but you still had a number of candidates who were competing. So
I wanted to pick up on one thing that Michelle said, because I think it's an overlooked part of the problem of the way that people live, is that fortunately, there's not complete segregation in our neighborhoods. So there may be pockets of different communities that are spread out across the county, Korean Americans or Vietnamese Americans or Somali Americans or pro-development Democrats or whoever they may be. And the beauty of a ranked system is that allows candidates who represent those voters' interests to campaign across a broader area with no risk that they're going to spoil a vote. But then, and let's say in a community, Vietnamese Americans make up 8%, but not enough to necessarily win a candidate per se, but candidates know that that's a sizable portion of the electorate whom they have to be responsible to. And that smaller constituency has an opportunity to say, if you want our vote, you've got to come and listen to what we have to say. Come to our community and hear our needs. And then candidates going forward, once elected, know where their votes came from, in essence, and that in order to get reelected, they have to actually do a good job serving the people who got them in office. And it allows, I think, and this is perhaps the thing that I like the best, but that scares incumbents the most, it's a more fluid and dynamic situation so that people evolve and interest groups cluster and move. And it's not like, oh, here are those voters who think this way over here, and here are those voters, and I'm going to take them for granted, but these people seem to be on the move, so I'm going to try to sew them up. But they're really responding to the interests of the voters and the voters themselves. I like to talk now about how these are really voter-driven systems. Voters have the choice, and they have powerful, meaningful votes in every election, which is not something we see really at any level in American democracy.
Ties into that notion of sort of reflective democracy of what you're looking at, both in terms of people and policies. I think we have time for one or two more questions, if there are.
And I'll just say, like, Cambridge, right, is an example of the city council. They use ranked choice voting for electing their council members. And again, I don't think they've seen a large field like we have right now in Montgomery County. But again, they have a very diverse council. And I think, again, looking at these different systems, and as we have more time to have more data to kind of see the impact of this, we're going to see how combining public financing, ranked choice voting, even some redistricting reform or other components of that help to create what we really want to see in democracy, where we have legislators who are working in our best interest and really engaging with us in the conversation in ways that we haven't seen recently, whether you're talking about Republicans or Democrats. So.
Sure.
Is that we have very low voter turnout in the primaries. So out of 645,000 voters, only 80,000 turned out in the 2014 primary. And the average voter was a 60-year-old white woman. So how do we incentivize more people to come out and vote? And do you think rank voting would do that, or some of the other interests that you talked about?
And I'd like to use that question to sort of kind of come down the panel in that sort of closing comment range, right? Because I think that's a little bit of a question of how can the system engage the voters. And talking about the circle, Michelle, you're talking about, you look like your people, the people are engaged, they vote, and you can really create that dialogue. So I don't know, why don't we start with Cynthia and move down to Saskia?
Sure. The numbers show us from the 2017 Minneapolis and St. Paul elections, and now from Santa Fe and from Bay Area elections, that the rate of turnout has gone up normal than average in those jurisdictions. And we see that as a very encouraging trend. And from some of the qualitative interviews that we did with voters, they felt like they knew their vote was going to count. Over 90% had a vote that led to some sort of representation, which is what keeps a voter engaged in the process. So I think that's it's demonstrable. We can say, wow, turnout is up in the cities that use ranked choice voting. There's not, I know the people who like to question things would say, oh, there are other reasons. We're like, well, sorry, it's a good correlation.
Own it. Yeah. Michelle.
I mean, participation is key, and when you're talking about ranked choice voting, and then you also have things like public financing, where there's more incentive. You as a voter are now like invested in multiple candidates, so that investment should translate into you going to the polls and getting your friends to go to the polls and saying, we need to vote for these candidates. So I think, again, we need to be, if we have an issue with participation, which we do not only in Montgomery County but across the United States, whether we're talking about primaries or general elections, then we need to be looking at all of the strategies that are available to us to increase participation. And if we're seeing that certain communities aren't as engaged, how do we get engaged and evaluate what isn't working in the system and really bring forward those reforms and create the demand across the country for reforms like ranked choice voting, for public financing, for structures within our system to allow for women and men to have the caregiving needs or other needs that they need to be able to be effective leaders in their respective areas. We need to be saying that these are the things that we want so that we have that reflective democracy. And we have the ability to do that now. There's many reforms we can implement now, many that will take a couple years to see, but if we start doing that now, we're going to be so amazed in the next 4 years what kind of democracy we actually have. So.
Yeah, and Saskia, maybe the last reflection, and then maybe sort of the voter engagement in European perspective.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I think the turnout question is an interesting one, and it connects well to this issue. I mean, there are other reasons why turnout in the US is lower on average than across European democracies, although there have been also some negative trends. It's kind of varied in European democracies. In some countries it's been going up, and some it's been going down, so it's a bit hard to find a general pattern. But what we do see is now when turnout goes up, like in the last UK elections, because young voters turn out to vote. They really cared after the Brexit vote. They went out and they mobilized. And I think that speaks to the question. Like young people, voters, they want to feel excited about the candidates they're voting for, right? That's what brings people out to vote, is that they feel like they have issues that they care about and they see candidates that are representing these issues. So I think the turnout question to me does connect to also who's running and how excited are the voters about who's running. Obviously, that's not just about the gender, it's also about the issues they stand for, but it's about having a diversity of candidates running, right? I think that really is an important tool, not the only one, but one important tool to get people more excited about democratic participation.
So this has been a great discussion about sort of not just the midterm elections, right, and who's going to win, but what democratic participation looks like, right, what democracy looks like, what systems and so forth. So I would like to thank the panelists, and I would like to encourage all of you to go online. Your paper is currently online, as I understand, and really engage around this, because I think ending on this sort of how do you get more voters and how do you get higher voter turnout, right, to sort of complete that circle of truly engaging with your democracy and your community is incredibly important. Cynthia, Michelle, Saskia, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Glenn.
Good job.
Thank you. Yeah, good job to you.
Thank you so much, Saskia.
Yeah, thank you for participating.
I hope that was fun.
Yeah.
How's your sister's campaign going?
It's going really well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just last night we found out we got an endorsement. What's the data? So that was like great, and.